Welcome, everyone. I'm Erica Wax, one of the co-founders of Impact 100 London. Thank you so much for joining us for our first lunchtime conversation, the topic of which, as you know, is tackling domestic abuse. Just a bit of housekeeping. We would love to have an active chat today, so please post your thoughts and any relevant resources in the chat box. Put questions in the Q&A box. They're both at the bottom of your screen. You can submit anonymously if you wish, that's fine. So some of you might have seen the chilling billboards on the A4 right now, which read, "Abusers always work from home." Our topic today couldn't be more timely, given that this is the first day of the second lockdown. For many of us, our eyes were open to the horror and prevalence of domestic abuse during the first lockdown. So we have lots of founding members on the call with us today. And it's also amazing to see so many new faces and names. And I thought I'd say a few words about Impact 100 London. For those of you who don't know us well, Impact 100 London is a collective philanthropy. We provide members an opportunity to engage in philanthropy, pool resources together, and vote to fund charities that benefit marginalized women and girls in London. We launched Impact 100 London less than a year ago because not only did we want to galvanize a community, but we saw critical need and underfunding in the women and girls sector. In June, our members voted to award our first large grant of £100,000 to Women's Trust. Women's Trust helps women in London affected by domestic abuse to overcome the mental and emotional harm caused by domestic abuse and to help them to rebuild their lives. One key tenet of our model is to maintain close ties with our grantees, providing a platform for them to raise their profiles and further engage with our members. With that, I'll now turn over to Lainey Martin, my co-founder.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Erica, and thanks for coming. We're very proud of our ongoing relationship with Women's Trust. The funding of mental health for victims of domestic abuse in London fits squarely within our mission at Impact 100 London. It's underfunded, it's serving a growing need and it has the potential to have a significant impact on outcomes for female victims. Additionally, simultaneously, we have a domestic abuse bill going in front of the House of Lords this month. So it is very relevant to be able to have a discussion now around the need, the funding gaps, and the potential actions, both by government members, but additionally as us as individuals and foundations. Despite the media coverage of domestic abuse, especially over lockdown, and then separately the mental health discussions that have been front and center, there still is a public awareness gap regarding the importance of addressing the mental health aspect of domestic abuse and its potential to break the cycle of repeat victimization. So we're really very pleased to have with us today our panelists and our moderator. We're thrilled that Heidi Rydell, the Executive Director of Women's Trust and our lead grantee, is here with us today. Nicole Jacobs, who will be the first designate domestic abuse commissioner for England and Wales. And they will be discussing domestic abuse, the bill, but particularly the focus on mental health. We're very excited that we have Edie Lush with us to moderate today. Edie is a veteran moderator and a professional public speaking coach, And we're very proud to say she is one of our founding members. So with that, we'll let the conversation begin. Very much looking forward to it. Thank you all for being here.
Delighted to be joining you live from Riyadh, in fact. So let's kick straight off. Nicole and Heidi, let me hear from you about how you both got involved in this field in the first place. And Nicole, let's start with you.
Oh gosh, thanks for asking. It's wonderful to be here, by the way. I probably started really genuinely back in when I was studying at university. So I'm originally from America, and my senior year studying politics.
Where were you?
I was at Hanover College in the Midwest.
Okay.
And I was actually in Philadelphia, though, doing an internship, and it was at a rape crisis center. And I then came back to my campus. And what I realized over the course of my last semester was that all of these friends I'd had for years, 4 years, once they knew I had a little bit of knowledge about sexual violence, sexual assault, would suddenly tell me things that had happened to them. These are friends that I had known for years. And it really opened my eyes up to one, the prevalence of domestic abuse, sexual violence, and also the fact that it's so hidden right in front of us in so many ways. And also when I was working at that internship, one thing that really struck me in supporting children who were coming to court, which was part of my job at the as part of the internship, was how many of the offenders, the perpetrators, were family members known to them. So we're kind of raised to fear strangers. But in actuality, and what I've known now for 20 plus years, is so much of this violence happens within the family, happens within known networks of people we know. And so that really changed my life, that internship, because it oriented me to be very interested in anything related to service provision. How do we address these issues that were quite shocking to me at the time and continue to be?
Thank you. So Heidi, how did you get involved in the field?
Yeah, well, my background is in public administration and some charitable trust management. I came to the UK in 2003. I'm originally from Germany. And when I came to the UK, I was really keen to get involved in an organization that had women at its heart. And that's how I looked for a specific organization that worked for women, and that's how I found Women's Trust. And I was just really impressed by the work that had been done, and also learning kind of what a huge issue this actually is, which I had really not realized at the time. So I initially volunteered with Women's Trust and then went into employment. This is really long time ago now, over 16 years. I really decided this is an area where I want to lead my career. And while I was working with Women's Trust, I did a master in civil society management, and then in 2010 became CEO of Women's Trust. I'm really driven by the difference our services can make in women's lives and the difference we make to their children. My biggest wish is actually that we can eliminate domestic abuse at some point, but as long as it exists, we at Women's Trust, we really want to ensure that specialist mental health services are available for women as and when they're needed. And we know kind of there's a long way to go to then make that happen.
Absolutely, especially in the current situation with lockdown version 2.0 and the pandemic continues. So Nicole, give us a feel of what you think the domestic abuse crisis is in the UK, if you think it is a crisis, and just give us a view of the overall landscape.
Okay. I mean, I think the interesting thing about the pandemic and what we're facing in this second lockdown is that everything we know and is challenging us really predates the pandemic. And what I mean by that is that our services for domestic abuse have built up over time. So we're talking about first refuges and network of refuges a little over 40 years ago. And the way that services have built up is very piecemeal and patchwork. And while it's great that we've made huge strides, in a lot of ways we have, what we have now is a provision of service, which number one is not adequate. It doesn't, as Heidi will tell you, it doesn't include the breadth of support and mental health support that is needed. It's very crisis oriented. So if someone is called the police and they've come to a house, there may be a provision of service in place for immediate protection, orders of protection, where if someone needs to move, all of those kinds of crisis-oriented responses. And even within those, we have a postcode lottery in terms of what provision is in any area in England and Wales, and that will differ. And the way that those services are funded are not sustainable. So they're funded by very often local authority funding, but very piecemeal, again, not sitting in core budgets, not there year in, year out. So there's a lot of recommissioning and a lot that services or charities have to do themselves to go look for funding elsewhere to, in fact, bring services to their local communities. So we have a long way to go. And that's part of the reason why I was appointed a year ago as an independent commissioner to really push that, map that service provision, push as much as we can to really get where we need to be, and we're not there yet. And in COVID, that's just come across even more. So much more pressure, much more limitation in terms of people's ability to reach out and get the help they need. And so all of those cracks in our foundations have come across very, very starkly during the COVID pandemic.
Cracks in the foundation. That's quite a good analogy. Heidi, let's come to you. We're going to address that issue around funding in a moment, but leaving that to one side for now, let's look at the mental health component of domestic abuse. Nicole mentioned that the services at the moment are focused on that immediate protection of people, sending the police and dealing with the immediate crisis. But tell me why it's so important to talk about this mental health issue. And can you give me an example of how you've seen women really recover when their mental health is focused on and supported?
So it's really important also to address the mental health effects. So one thing, kind of, women sometimes might not even, because of mental health issues they face, they might not be even able to engage with services, because the mental health effects are so debilitating on their everyday life. They find it really difficult to function. So specialist services are really important, because we offer an understanding of the experience of women who have been affected by domestic abuse. We have been specialists for over 25 years now with a proven track record. We understand how trauma and how it affects women, and that is really important. And that's what others, general services often don't do. We help women to understand what actually is domestic abuse, to help and break that cycle. At the same time, we don't advise women what to do. It's really important that women are in the driving seat and they make the decision, however they want to move forward. How we do this is we give women a space to talk so she can find her own answers and solutions. We're using a person-centered approach. We give women the power to discover their own internal validation, so they can see that they can value herself. She can value herself, and it's not just valued through others. It can help her rediscover who she is and what she wants. Her own sense of identity has often been lost through abuse, isolation that she experienced, especially via gaslighting, for instance. We help her to understand that the way she is feeling.
Is it worth just describing what gaslighting is? Because it's a word that gets tossed around, and I don't even know if everyone knows what it means.
Yeah, so with gaslighting, it's kind of a constant it's a constant way. Nicole, can you help me out for a moment?
Yes, of course. I mean, I'm sure there's ways to describe it that there might be better for me, but it's this idea of always making you question yourself, that, behaviors that would make you second guess. Am I remembering correctly? So
So a kind of constant undermining of somebody.
yeah.
Undermining,
Abuse is
absolutely,
very,
yeah.
A very common tactic is minimizing what they do, denying it completely, blaming the victim. And so if that's the context you live in, it's not unusual to talk to a survivor of domestic abuse who will have been severely abused the day before, and the perpetrator, their partner, won't even acknowledge that it happened, as if it never happened. And if you can think of if those kinds of examples are piling up day in, day out, it really eventually makes you question your ability to understand, is this happening? What's happening to me? Everything is it can get very confused and conflated. And so that's a very common experience, for people. And it takes, one thing I would absolutely say, Impact 100 chose an exceptionally good charity to support, because it takes people a while to disentangle what's happened to them. A lot of times people will say, I wasn't even calling it domestic abuse. I just knew that I felt scared. I was fearful. I felt harassed. And it's only when later that they'll reflect and think, I really am starting to see the pattern of what was going on. And it takes a real expert, professional, supportive environment to do that. And that's exactly what Women's Trust does. And it's so vitally important to people's recovery. There's a really great longitudinal study in the UK, in fact, the only one, and it's called Finding the Cost of Freedom. It was by a professor called Liz Kelly, and she spoke about it taking 2 years for people to even come close to kind of recovering from their experience. But yet our service system is in place only for a few months for that crisis. So what happens after that? All the building your life back, and the isolation you've experienced, that all has to come somewhere. And it's in places like the Women's Trust that really kind of rebuilding of yourself happens.
Thank you. Heidi, anything to add from your perspective on that?
Yeah, so it is really kind of a really huge thing is for women also that they don't they don't understand initially the what is domestic abuse. It's often women feel still when they come to us, it's their fault. They have done something, that this has happened to us, and this is often a huge eye opener for women. That actually what happens to them is the perpetrator. It's not their fault.
Interesting. So,
and it's also how the trauma is affecting them, that women feel quite very guilty. Go ahead, Edie.
No, so I wanted to move on to the bill that's currently in Parliament, because Nicole, we're calling you the Domestic Abuse Commissioner Designate. I'm tempted to just say Your Excellency. How about that? Or Your Excellency Designate. But there's a bill in Parliament that would create this position. Lainey talked about it at the top there. Give us the high level of what this bill does and also what it doesn't do.
Okay, it's a massively important bill because it gives us our first statutory definition or legal definition of domestic abuse, which probably some of people listening would be very surprised to hear. Up until now, we've worked to an agreed cross-departmental government definition, which has been okay. But this now on the face of the bill creates a definition that includes the whole range of coercion and controlling behaviors. So not just physical abuse or sexual abuse, but all of the things people do to control. But it includes financial economic abuse, which is really an important step forward. There's a great organization called Surviving Economic Abuse, which has really helped generate interest and awareness and some very concrete steps to really address that. It also recognizes children in their own right as victims of domestic abuse. And then the bill kind of creates it. I always say it has a lot of moving parts. It has about 9 different kind of key elements, some of which are about improving the criminal justice system, the civil justice system, family courts, things like prohibiting perpetrators or abusers from cross-examining their former partner in family court, which, believe it or not, happens.
Wow.
So it does things like that. It gives a statutory underpinning for my role, which allows me to get at public information, make very specific recommendations that have a timeline to be responded to, lots of things like that. It gives a statutory duty for refuge provision, so accommodation-based services, which is obviously not the whole of provision for everyone, but a very important part of our services. And it allows for people to approach homelessness options in local authorities for domestic abuse, regardless of whether they have children or not. So there are things in it that are really vitally important and a great step forward. And the bill will next go to the House of Lords. I think, unfortunately, we thought it would be this month. I'm told that that's going to be pushed back a little bit because of Brexit legislation and some emergency COVID legislation. So we're thinking more now at the start of the calendar year. But the plus side of that is it gives all of you plenty of time to get in touch with your legislators, because there are some improvements to the bill that we'd love to see.
Okay, so Heidi, from your perspective, what would those improvements be? What would you like to see as a component of Nicole's mandate?
Yeah, we really would want to see the bill to address the mental health impact on survivors. So at the moment, it just addresses the mental health effects on children, but there's no thinking of the actual direct provision for survivors. And there's no duty on a national or local government to provide or commission those services, which is really an issue. The bill places also duty on the Secretary of State to issue guidance on the use on children's mental health. Yeah, as I said, but not for women. Local authorities, we feel, will need to produce a strategy for the provision of supportive services from this, but we need to really see this happening, not just for these crisis services, but also the services we need. We need, and overall, a funding promise is needed.
Okay, Heidi, you've frozen there for a minute. So let's come back to Nicole. Henrietta Fore, the head of UNICEF, told me recently we face a crisis across every aspect of the pandemic.
I'm not quite sure. Have I lost you?
We've got you, but hold tight. We'll come back to you in just a minute, Heidi. But Nicole, so the point is that we face a crisis in really most parts of development, across the Sustainable Development Goals, if you come from my world. And we won't get back without an unprecedented level of cooperation. So I'd love to hear how the government is working with various organizations that are focusing on domestic abuse and how you think you might be able to augment that.
Yeah, this is a question I get asked a lot, which is, is the government doing enough? And do they recognize what this lockdown and what this pandemic means in relation to domestic abuse? And on one hand, I would say very much yes. At the very beginning of the lockdown, our Department for International Development sent me a paper that was highlighting the risks for people in domestic abuse and wider violence against women and girls issues. And it's been a totally open door in terms of government ministers really acknowledging the really obvious problem of lockdown and domestic abuse, because it really allows the perpetrator to have so much more control. And of course, that's the whole, it creates all kinds of problems in terms of help seeking. And I host a call every week with all of our national helplines and with all of the key services and government departments. And I can tell you what you've read in the media or heard in the media is absolutely true. I mean, the help seeking through the lockdown period has skyrocketed in terms of people calling helplines, accessing web chats, web pages, so much help seeking. But worryingly, what we've seen is kind of a drop off in contact with other services, The police, for example, for many weeks throughout lockdown, didn't have an increase in referrals or contact. And then as the lockdown eased, it started creeping up again and above rates for this time last year. So you do really get a sense of how much the lockdown restricts someone's ability to seek help. Call the police, call anyone, but we'll do it quietly, very much behind the scenes if it's safe to do so. And then more concrete help seeking action, going to the refuge, calling the police, making a complaint comes when lockdown eases, when the ability to have that contact with the outside world is happening. But in the meantime, doing a lot of damage to many people. And that is my big concern as we emerge, or, as of today, go into a second lockdown period.
Yes, a lot of concerns as we go into the second lockdown. So Heidi, since you've received the Impact 100 grant and we've gone through the summer, now back into lockdown 2.0, what have you been up to? And I'd love to hear, of course, that the grant allowed you to solve all your problems, but I have a feeling that it didn't. And this is maybe when we could lead on to your point about funding and the gap in funding that you see as an example of some of the things that Nicole was mentioning earlier.
Yeah. Well, I wish they had solved all our problems. But however, we are really grateful. While it hasn't solved the problems, it is a multiple-year grant. And that is in itself really helpful. It is vital to sustain our funding. And I will speak a bit later about this as well, because how we are funded as an organization. So since the first lockdown, we have gone through a huge transition. So we moved obviously all our face-to-face services to remote working. We started with telephone counseling, but have now also followed up for a couple of months with a group provision for the workshops and support groups. The demand has been rising even before lockdown and is escalating now. And obviously the pandemic and the lockdown have heightened the risk of women for domestic abuse. It is kind of, we know women are living in terror. And with that, obviously the mental health deteriorates really dramatically. We have been able to secure short-term funding, government funding. We have been actually quite successful altogether, which has been really great, but it's all short term. Some of this funding has already ended in October. Some will last until March. And obviously, our referrals will not stop when this funding stops. As Nicole says, it's likely that the demand will further increase. But what this funding has allowed us is that we have been able to increase our resources. We had quite a number of many women who were not able to enter in our services because of their family situation, because they might be with the perpetrator. So we have been able to provide check-ins with women on a regular basis. We have been able to increase our capacity to from 5 to 9 employed counselors. We're expecting to be able to deliver 20 to 25% more sessions than we had delivered before. So this has been all really, really helpful. But the point is now we have to look now for next year to sustain our work. And all these grants have been short term. Just to say also, we had to turn women away despite this additional funding. Yeah, so we had about 40 women within the boroughs we work in, but also then referrals from other boroughs we had where we could not take women on. We have to scale our service according to the funding we have available. So it's not a lot of commissioning for our work. Our mental health is always seen as add-on. We had a couple of times last year where we had to actually decline to get engaged with partnerships because the money that was left to actually go into these contracts was not worthwhile. Was not enough to create any worthwhile service, which is really frustrating. So in the next year, we really have to, we know already, to just to maintain the services we have now, we need to raise 500,000 pounds, and that is a lot for an organization of our size. A lot of our funding comes through trusts and foundations, as there is very limited government funding. But with that is a lot of short-term grants. Some of them are quite small. We have about 38 different funders, and when I looked at it, 21 of those gave us funding under 5,000 pounds. So there's a lot of administration that goes into securing these funds. Yeah. So there's quite a challenge ahead of us in the next year.
That sounds pretty challenging. There's loads of questions coming into the Q&A, and Heidi and Nicole, I'll invite you to look at those. I'll pick one out, the one that first came through from Alvina. She's asking you to outline, Nicole, your priorities for the first year to ensure that domestic violence is embedded into the UK's strategic priorities, local, regional, and national role.
Yeah, I did read that question and I thought, oh gosh, that's a long answer. I have a whole presentation on that, but right now I'd say the priorities very much are COVID related. So my day to day and my team that I'm building is very much about focusing on, for example, I'll be spending a good bit of the day talking to government about the priorities for the month ahead in terms of public awareness, funding for services through to the end of the year, which is not ideal, but in terms of just making sure in the here and the now, how are we doing to get through this period ahead? So there's a lot of things like that. There's bill related work, but I would also say into the future, it's very much about mapping service provision, being much more precise about what we actually have and what good looks like. And there's lots and lots of ways and points, information to gather in terms of that, which is why in the bill, having a duty to cooperate with my office is a really important power so that we can get at information more quickly. And then absolutely that then folds into driving recommendations, really having a policy team that's going to be looking across all parts of government on the national and local level to really try to drive that change as much as possible. Some of what holds us back, believe it or not, and this surprised me when I first came into the role, is government has lots and lots of information, but what we haven't done very well in this sector of work is really being precise and forensic about mapping what we do have. So for example, how many organizations are there in England and Wales that are similar to Women's Trust? I mean, Heidi probably has a guess and probably knows of some, but I can tell you there wouldn't be that many in actuality, because a lot of people assume that this all gets taken care of in acute mental health trusts. And the fact is that's not the case. There are many acute mental health trusts, but a lot of women who've experienced domestic abuse may not be meeting kind of quote unquote thresholds for those services. They may not be really adapted as Women's Trust is to really address these issues and know a lot about domestic abuse, sexual violence, and really address things properly. There are some good points of practice within acute mental health trust. So another ambition of mine is to figure out where all these good practices are and amplify that and make sure that those become much more common practices. There's no reason why, and there's really a great need for systemic change within a lot of our services, housing services, health services, obviously criminal justice, family courts, where all of our systems essentially lag behind in many ways our understanding of what happens to women or what happens to people who are subject to domestic abuse. And we really have to find ways of, through data, but through also finding what practice we want to see and amplify and really try to push that ahead. So that's in general the strategic ambition of my office.
Great. So question coming through from Evadne. This I'm going to give to Heidi. So we must appreciate that the amount of domestic verbal abuse as well as physical is not often spoke about in social classes 1 and 2, especially at the moment, with husbands worrying about job loss, working from home, etc. How are these women or families able to access your services? Or do you know how many of these women are accessing services versus those from social classes 4 and 5? Now that's getting pretty technical. Maybe you can break that down for us in your answer, Heidi.
But when you mean by social, can you just verify the classes you're talking about?
So no, I can't, but maybe Evadne can, or maybe Nicole can.
I just assume from that she's talking about just the difference in socioeconomic background, essentially. Yeah.
We know domestic abuse can happen to everyone, and I think that's why there is a lot of confusion. So it's one in 4 women that will experience this domestic violence at some point in their lives. We have women in high positions, very successful business women coming to using our services. There is, and I think that's the issue, that a lot of people still think it's a particular a part of the population that this is happening to. This is really not the case. Yeah. So if we have 100 women taking part in this webinar today, there is likely 25 who will have or will experience domestic abuse at some point. And things what we find that is actually the emotional abuse, the verbal abuse, emotional abuse is much higher initially than what the physical abuse, and that was also more longer lasting for women. Those scars, they last often longer than what's happened physically to women, and is affecting the trauma of women.
So we'll go, there's so many good questions. What about the role of educating boys on how to treat women well? We can help women, but unless we can also reach young boys, the pipeline of abusive men will continue. Nicole.
I think, one important step forward is that there's an expectation as of this school year, at least in our state schools, for this to be part of the curriculum for the first time. So there has been work in schools, but traditionally it's been kind of down to the head teacher, for example, to agree to a charity particularly, or someone who might come in and do that type of work. But now we have this as a core part of the curriculum. Some of that is being delayed with COVID, obviously, because of all the disruption in schools. But in general, throughout this year, and the Department of Education is keeping an eye on this, how is this being implemented? It's for primary and secondary. And so
there's a question coming in. Do you know which education, what kind of education works the best? Like what makes that long-term difference?
Well, I think that the idea of what is being expected, which is starting very early, talking about not coming in at a certain age and just talking about domestic abuse as such, but talking about relationships, healthy relationships, what makes a good relationship, building blocks over time as year groups proceed. So there's been a lot of guidance produced for schools and to implement this. And I think that is really genuinely a great step forward. But there is a lot of research about outside of the school environment, what is it that really changes people's attitudes? And some of it is, again, taking a step back from not starting off talking about domestic abuse as such, but talking about issues related to gender and gender inequality. And places like in Australia, there's some really good research that indicates that actually changes people's attitudes into the future much better. I also think we have to personally do a lot more in when people are in early relationships, girls and boys, really doing some really proactive intervention and support as they're learning kind of what is normal. People are picking up, as we all do, a lot of messages on social media that really counter some of what we would like young people to be thinking about in terms of healthy relationships. And that's a huge concern. So I think we have to do a lot more for children in schools, but also just programs for children and support services for children in general.
So before we go on, we're running out of official time. So Heidi and Nicole, do you have 5 extra minutes to stay on, or do you guys need to go at the top of the hour?
I could stay for 5. Yeah.
Okay. You okay, Heidi, for 5?
No, I'm fine. I'm fine to stay.
Okay, we'll crack
I'm
on.
fine. I'm fine. Yes.
Okay, so this is a question for both of you. How has the pandemic affected the urgency and awareness of the domestic abuse bill and agenda? Heidi.
Well, it's. I think it has really heightened the awareness what is happening. We were really pleased to see that the media was picking this up really much more. We have done a lot of interviews ourselves, and you could really read about the increase of domestic abuse overall. And that's obviously then also linked to the domestic abuse bill, and shows the importance how to have these support services in place and bring funding in. And we hope it will actually help to push this bill through, hopefully with the changes in mental health we want to see.
Thank you. So there's a question about age ranges. The age ranges are younger women and girls experiencing domestic abuse more in the UK. And there's also a question actually widening the definition. We've been talking about women and girls. I'm curious to see, are you seeing increased reports of abuse among trans women as well, for example? Nicole.
Yeah, I think the general feel is that obviously this happens in all age ranges. I think some of the differences in age range and also socioeconomically, where people will go to for support and advice will vary. So you might see younger women, particularly in services, because they know about them. People think and are identifying and talking to them about domestic abuse. I was on a call yesterday that was based in Wales, but it was about older women, and just saying how often domestic abuse will be overlooked and not talked about, and also their view of what services are available might be different from someone who has who's younger, essentially. So I think things will, the prevalence rates are very similar, but I guess the way people seek help and support can differ. And so I would just want to acknowledge that. I think in relation to the bill, in my last few minutes, just my final plug, I suppose, about that, is that what we've realized in the pandemic is how critical these services are, how much we depend on them. And one of the key things that we could change in the bill is to widen this. We have already in the bill a statutory duty, a new duty for refuge provision to really help support that type of service. But why wouldn't we, given all of what we've heard today, widen that duty to include community-based services, ones like Women's Trust, but also the emergency services we've talked about. And that's what we've seen in the pandemic, that we need these services so much. And so it's a really great message.
What can people on the call here today do to help you support that?
You literally could contact your MP and say, this bill is urgent. We need to see it progressing now. Don't let other legislation get in the way. And I really want to see you supporting the elements of this bill, and also supporting an expansion of that statutory duty for all services. One of the questions I spotted in the chat was about the most marginalized people. And I really would want the bill to cover services so that no matter if someone has any recourse to public funds, maybe they're here on a student visa or a different type of visa that doesn't allow them the same kinds of access as citizens. If they're suffering domestic abuse, they should have access to all services available. And that's another key change in the bill. If you happen to know anyone who's in the House of Lords, that's also a great avenue right now, in particular, because they get into such a lot of detail, and they really do help improve the bill process, and they really push government to answer questions about the bill. And then, of course, it will go back to the House of Commons for a final vote. So either way.
Okay, so is there some language that if we wanted to contact our MP with, is there some easy language that we can access to put into an email?
Yeah, I'd be happy to share my own table that I give out about possible amendments to the bill that would be important, and it also includes websites of some of the key the key charities who are really supporting the development of some of those amendments. So I think it would be a good document that I'd be really happy to share.
Okay, so we will get that out to everyone on the call. So Heidi, let's come to you for a final thought. What's your call to action to the audience today, how they can have an impact addressing domestic abuse and mental health?
Well, I would like to agree with Nicole. Kind of, if like really use your contacts to advocate and influence the government on domestic abuse and the needs for our services. So yeah, really, I just would highly recommend if you could do that. If you want to do something for us particular as an organization, to help our sustainability. We obviously really grateful what Impact 100 has done as with the funding for us. But if you want to do something as an individual and do something further, yeah, you can organize a fundraiser for Women's Trust. Do something, it can be something small. Do a long run or walk. Yeah, give up alcohol for months. Especially also now when we do all our Christmas shopping, yeah, or you do a grocery shopping, there's Give As You Live, yeah, where you can put us down as a charity you want to provide. It doesn't cost you anything. It has been really staggering. Kind of, we have raised £37,000 at the beginning of the lockdown when we put our peer out through these kind of activities. It has been really fantastic. And generally, the last thing, raise awareness of domestic abuse in general. Educate yourself. So if you, it's very likely that there will be someone around you who might be experiencing domestic abuse. Could be a friend, even a family member, and you might just not know yet. Yeah, find out. Yeah, visit our website. There's lots of information and lots of other websites you can go to find out what you can do and what services are available. So you're ready to help a friend or family member if it needs to be.
Thank you very much to Heidi and to Nicole, and I'll hand back to Lainey and Erica now. Oh, you're still on mute, Erica.
Here I go. Okay. I just wanted to thank Heidi, Nicole, and Edie so much for this incredibly informative and frankly sobering discussion. And, you know, to Heidi and Nicole, I just wanted to add a thank you for just your many, many, many years that you've dedicated to helping women who suffer from domestic abuse to rebuild their lives and find, you know, or refine their sense of self. So, you know, and really just being champions for them. So, I mean, it's shocking that it's taken this long to have a domestic abuse bill to begin with. And I, you know, think, of course, this is a step in the right direction. You know, we learned today that there's definitely more that can and should be done. So, you know, I think this discussion made clear how important really organizations like Women's Trust are and how critical it is for private investors like Impact 100 London to fund them. So we will be sending around a list of resources, you know, definitely including, I know Nicole mentioned Finding the Cost of Freedom. We'll get a hold of that, but we'll be sending around, you know, probably tomorrow. And we'll also, you know, work with Nicole's office to get her draft template for letters in case people want to send letters to their MPs or members of the House of Lords. That would be fantastic. Lainey?
Yes, I also thank you so much, Nicole and Heidi and Edie. That was fantastic. And to all of our participants today, really appreciate all of your questions and engagement. I mean, this event is exactly how we envision Impact 100, the model working, you know, in partnership with our grantees, Women's Trust, our members, and in, you know, to build just greater awareness and understanding of the issues that are out there, and to, you know, sort of be a catalyst to activity and to really trying to solve things at of various levels. So we're so gratified that in addition to Women's Trust, we also funded the Girls Network and the Change Foundation last year. They each received £15,000 as well. And they're also delivering really important services to marginalized women and girls, mentoring and sports for change. So with that, we're excited to say that we are actually embarking on our 2021 grant cycle imminently. We're going to open for renewals and new membership next week. And so we just want to extend an invitation to everyone to join us and to get involved and to help us to invest more funds into these charities that are doing such critical work, right here in our backyard in London. So there's membership information on our website. We'll also have your email. We can send you things out. And Anila Schuckberg, our membership lead, maybe she can pop her email just in the chat quickly, and you can obviously just go to her directly as well. And with that, we really, really appreciate your time today. And we look forward to continued engagement with all of you. This is, these are the kind of events that really can make a difference.
Thank you.